partnership. Over the past 8 years, Tremco, which is a company that mostly focuses on roofing and sealants for curtain walls, which often seems to be something that we may not imagine being terribly creative or integral to things that we might do, has actually been a wonderful innovator in applying technology originally created for the pharmaceutical industry in mixing very precise amounts of things for treating human situations, disease and other situations, has actually applied a lot of that from their other industrial partners to making higher quality roofing and sealants. And they are a leader they're probably the worldwide leader in green roof technology. And so a couple of years before they established with us the Tremco Sustainable Practices Partnership here, they worked with the University of Toronto and still do. And they've created an annual lecture or 2 a year like we have, and also created a thing called GRIT, the Green Roof Innovative Technology Lab. And Tremco is a great partner because they believe in students and they believe in working with schools from their industry relation in providing roofing and sealants. And their innovation is really the key. Their design innovation, and they're working with architects and engineers to improve the quality of the environment. Something you'll hear a little bit more about this spring, which happens just about this time, is that we have a Tremco Sustainable Practices Prize for a graduate student. And we look through a lot of your projects. As you know, we see them all, and you all get to present them to all of us regularly. And there is an annual Tremco Sustainable Practices Prize for $1,000 that Tremco awards to one of you for your fine work. And now a little bit about tonight's lecture. One of the things I really appreciate is the announcements that came out had a little bit of a bio or a little bit of a background on the speakers, as we always keep evolving the way we talk about or promote the series. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some other things about what I may understand about Rob Goodwin and Perkins and Will, and how I think they're important for the series and important for the school. It's great to welcome back Rob Goodwin to the school for this lecture. Rob is design director at Perkins and Will in New York, and he returns today after leading a spring 2021 graduate design studio here as a teaching firm in residence. In addition to you knowing about Rob's achievements and credentials, I thought I'd share some other things which I just told you. Rob in his teaching last year brought many architecture, landscape, and other colleagues to the studio. He also demonstrated what was for me exceptional commitment to understanding and working with students and helping all of you all innovate in developing your ideas within a context of a major city like New York, and with the program being explored. The collegiality he shared with our students and those he brought shows a great confidence that architecture and how we teach it is constructive and helps us all progress so that we can better create and conserve the environment. On a related note, Rob's colleague at Perkins and Will in New York, managing principal Bill Harris, has participated in final reviews at Roger Williams for more than 25 years, every year. So we appreciate the commitment that Rob brings and that Bill Harris has brought over many years. Another thing I'd like to raise a little bit to have you keep in mind a little bit about Rob and Perkins and Will, is they also participated in our job forum, which was held over the last few weeks, the last couple weeks of February. In my sitting in on some of the introductions that day, Perkins and Will presented some of the history of the firm. And if you may or may not know that much about Perkins and Will yet, but it's really one of the most important US architecture firms over the certainly last 75 years, which is about, it's a little more than 75 years that they've been a firm. And as I walked in the room, one of the images on the screen, not that I was around 75 years ago, no matter what Greg Laramie will tell you, but there was an image of the Crow Island School, which was a notable early project of the firm. And I saw it when I was in school as in the great canon of emerging modern architecture. Again, even though I wasn't that old. And what was notable about it in the way they presented it, and also I think for its standing in the sort of history of modern architecture, and I think in the values of the firm, is that it was notable clearly for its architectural presence, but also for how thoughtful it was about how students learn. And that's really important, to imagine how we design for and how we organize all of the efforts of concepts and schemes and scale, but how it relates to human practices. And I'm guessing this might be some of what Rob is going to get at when he pursues his lecture on human and nature. Rob is also clearly committed to a continuity across time by being a design director in a firm that's clearly older than he is also. And there's ideas about that I wanted to raise, just because I think it's important to consider, how do we all think of our trajectories? How do we fit in? How do we continue things? How do we start anew? And I think Rob has a lot to offer in that, because he clearly is doing it and he's leading that with other people. And again, one of the most important American firms in our lifetimes. So thank you all for coming tonight, both here in person in particular and those on Zoom, and for being part of the community of the school. Please welcome Rob Goodwin for his lecture, Human Nature. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. As Steve mentioned, that Perkins & Will is a large firm, and I just work in the New York studio, and I'm going to show you some work pretty much just from the New York studio. So it's sort of a slice of everything we do. Let me just make sure I've got this. Yeah. Oh, there we go. Okay. So over the last 2 years, we've had a pretty interesting time, to say the least. Our lives have been impacted in so many ways, and the changes that we've experienced will probably never return to the way they were before. We've seen some truly tragic events, but we've also seen some wonderful things. And while I don't love the design of what I see here, what I love about this is that this is bringing healthcare from buildings into the street and making public healthcare truly public. That's something that wouldn't have happened without what we went through. And the experience of those 2 years, I think, has also changed our understanding of how we live, how we work, how we learn, how we interact with each other. And it's fascinating to me how the pandemic has created a world where things that were distinct have somehow merged, and that it's sometimes hard to discern now the difference between them. And this, I don't think, is necessarily a bad thing. It starts to give us an opportunity to break patterns and paradigms, and that can be transformative and re-energizing. And it's been said that the changes that we're experiencing over the course of the last 2 years are really just an acceleration of things that were already in place before the pandemic. So as designers, our role is essentially to imagine the future. And to do that, we have to sort of see around corners and through walls and find ways to challenge those outdated patterns and those obsolete paradigms. And so for us, we see this as an inspiring time. and where we can find new meaning in the merging of those things that were once distinct. The thought here about this theme is that for us, human experience can be enhanced by the experience of nature, and how nature can be enhanced and restored and regenerated by the way we design for it. So I want to show you a series of projects that, address this. Over the last couple of years, we've developed at Perkins a way to structure this thinking called living design. And it's intended to go beyond conventional sustainability and merge strategies for resilience and regeneration and inclusion, wellness, into a comprehensive approach that is based on the integration of human experience in the natural world that we live in. And while this is a relatively new system, let's call it, or approach, as I mentioned before, the pandemic has actually accelerated, trends that existed previously. So what I want to show you is a series of projects that reflect where some of that thinking began, and then how that work has evolved into current day. So with that, the first project here is a project we won in Suzhou in China in about 10 years ago in a competition for a science campus, about 450,000 square feet. So a pretty large project. And if you've ever known Suzhou or learned about it, it's known for its water gardens and the sort of delicate integration of landscape and architecture. And we were really inspired by that history, that culture. And but we began with the idea that this science campus, that the traditional or the conventional mode you might address in that is the sort of the American quad, with the space in the middle and the buildings around it. And we wanted to really explore a way to make that relationship more integrated, more woven, and more intimate. And so we looked at this idea of essentially a weaving of those systems together, and with a series of strategies that looked at program as well as sustainability to drive the form of the building. So in this case, the landscape basically rising up, merging with program, which were essentially the lecture halls with the high access spaces that needed to be at the ground, and then creating a loop circulation that joined them all together, and then inserting into that a metal armature, so that the idea of the kind of connection or weaving of man and nature in that diagram, and then the program space inserted into that, all of those bars oriented north or east-west to optimize solar exposure, and creating these academic gardens in between the spaces. So that's what this looks like looking down one of the main axes of this. And as you can see, the lecture halls with these angled surfaces enclosing them, with sometimes a green roof and sometimes not, and water in between, and actually creating some quite intimate spaces instead of a large quad, in spaces that were essentially extensions of the learning environment into the outdoors, and spaces that students could really inhabit. At the same time, quite a proactive strategy for sustainability, collecting the stormwater in the building, using it for those water gardens, but also reusing it for use in the buildings as well, and treating it on site, and creating a series of different environments that have a very strong indoor-outdoor quality, and a lot of, I think, interesting sort of diagonal views through the space. and ultimately a campus that's been quite successful, and they've continued to grow. Since then, we competed for the next round, and somehow they didn't choose us for that. I don't know why, but there's a lot of competition for these projects. So one first project, and that's in an educational environment. The second one is also an educational project. This is in a very different place. This is at SUNY Albany in upstate New York. This project was the first building that was built just outside of Edward Durrell Stone's massive campus that was built in the mid-60s as part of the post-war Nelson Rockefeller growth of the state system in New York. And this was the first building that was sort of allowed to be built outside of the podium. The podium is about a third of a mile long. The four quadrants are dorms, and the middle is an academic center or complex. And we had a number of requirements here. One is that we couldn't build above the height of the podium, which is equivalent of 3 stories. So we came up with a strategy that pushed a good amount of the program below grade. And in doing so, the challenge there was how could you bring light and nature into that lower space without having that feel like a basement? At the same time, because it was right at the front of the campus, it really had to act as a gateway, not just to the business school, but to the entire campus and would be. So we had to think about different types of circulation and how they could be directed to an upper level terrace for the business school, at grade level circulation that went through the building to the rest of the campus, and then a stair that went down into general classrooms that linked to the rest of the campus. So that had us look at this idea of carving the landscape out and bringing the space and nature into the building through this very transparent triple glazed wall that faced to the entry. And you can see here this sort of notion of what we like to call sort of a vertical and horizontal atrium, that it opened vertically at the same time as it opened horizontally and allowed space to come in from both directions, but also to have a series of occupiable spaces within that really became the home for the students. So some views of what that looked like as you enter, and those choices of going up, staying level, or going down. And then the space on the left is the upper business school space that's used for gathering, but also for events. And then the lower level on the right, which is the cafe outside of a series of general purpose classrooms. Oops, went the wrong way. In terms of sustainability for this building, Albany is actually one of the cloudiest places east of the Mississippi. So the challenge there was not to shade the sun, but to get it into the building. So we developed this series of vertical fins that actually are oriented to bounce light into the space, as well as a skylight system that does sort of the same thing. It's sort of a butterfly shape that opens up towards the sun and bounces it into the interior, which actually created sort of a delicate texture on the exterior of the wall. I think worked quite well, all the while being within a state school budget, which can be demanding, and turned out pretty well. LEED Gold project. Turning to science, this is a different project at University of Michigan. And here the challenge was that was water. It was on a site that was on the uphill side of what they call the diag in University of Michigan, which has a diagonal pathway through it, but is actually a quadrangle for the engineering school, not the main campus, but the engineering campus. And they had challenges because water was streaming down on the north side of the site into this area and really need to be managed when we built this project. At the same time, a lot of the dormitories were to the north, and we had to find a way to enhance the pathway from the dorms into the quad or the diag, because at the time there was really no direct path. So as you can see in this section, the idea of really having a building that enhances connectivity through the site. In terms of the way we dealt with water, we also took the notion of lifting the building up. There was also, in this case, program below grade for some of the laboratory spaces. And so we essentially took that volume and raised it, created clear story windows around the perimeter, and then used all of that space that sloped down into that lower area to manage stormwater and direct it to both cisterns and to farther down the slope. And, you know, at the same time, looking at how you can really optimize daylight in a building like this, where you have the juncture between an existing and a new building, and through a series of skylights and as much visibility as we could create in that environment. The last thing that was interesting here was that the North Campus, where this existed, is really not, if you've been to the Michigan campus, not the center of things. And there was an interest there in bringing attention to engineering. So one of the things we found was that a lot of the research that was done there had some really fascinating graphics on their website. You can see on the lower right. And we created this idea of integrating an LED matrix into the end wall of the building that gets seen all the way across the approach to campus. So this idea of creating a sense of identity for the engineering school and the labs here through this light pattern at night was one of the innovations here. You can see here, that's the stair also that leads you through the campus. Another science project closer to home in New York City. This is for Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. This is a clinical laboratory where they basically do testing of blood and samples and things to find out, you know, basically how healthy you are. And so this is a mid-block building on 64th Street between 1st and 2nd in Manhattan, with a very constrained zoning, very defined street wall height, and we really had to maximize all of this space we could. It's very expensive real estate. And so here, because it faced south, the notion here was, how do we make that research environment into a positive experience for the people working there? And you know, the notion of bringing light into that space, and how do we address that? And instead of thinking about simply shading that with sunshades or something to make that controlled, in New York City, you work not just with the orientation of the building, but also the context around you and the buildings around you. And what we did was we mapped the actual solar insolation that came not just from the sun, but the way that was affected by the buildings around it. And what we discovered was that there was a range of more sun on the upper left here and a lot less sun on the lower left. So we created a pattern here that used a ceramic frit that overlaid on a series of layers. So basically the structure of the building, the panelization of the wall, a figure, and then a pattern that gradated from lower left to or lower right to upper left here to actually only provide the shading where it was needed and allow more light where it could occur. And you know, one of the things that happens in cancer research these days, it's very much based on genetics. So there's an abstraction here of a DNA spiral in a very abstract way that sort of informed the pattern that was applied on the facade, but also with the idea of a less dense pattern here and a more dense pattern on this side, which I think in the end became quite a compelling identity for them. The bottom is where the vehicles come in to deliver the specimens. And so it's not really a public building, but it does have a very public facade and as much transparency as we could provide. Just some views of the inside. One of the things that happened when you build in New York with a lab building is that you're not able to put all of that mechanical up on the roof. So we call this the iceberg building because half of it seems to be below grade. But I think ultimately created really quite nice light quality in the interior of the building and a positive environment for people who work there. So moving from science to healthcare, this is another building where nature was an inspiration. This is Lucile Packard Children's Hospital in Palo Alto, and the challenge here was that there was really an intent to maintain the very strong relationship to landscape and climate that happens in that part of the world. And so we configured the building. It's essentially a addition, a large 500,000 square feet. So it's a large addition to an existing building that did have an interior courtyard that was quite memorable. And so we configured the building to create as many exterior courtyards as we could and create a very strong relationship or balance between building and landscape, and to connect that to the existing courtyard, which is here through the building. And at the same time, at a more detailed level, to think about how we could create an envelope for the building that always permitted the patient to have some view of that nature, whether it was the courtyard that was created, or in this case, we actually designed in a planter outside of every patient's window so that they could be in a bed and look out and see, ideally, not just planting, but potentially birds and insects, and that small moment of nature that could have a very intimate relationship with the patient. And part of the challenge there is, how do you do that if you have too much sun and you just have to put the blind down all the time? Then you can't see that. So we came up with a series of shading elements that actually allowed you to always leave that blind open, because that controlled the sun instead of the blinds. And you can see here that treating the east-west facades and the north-south facades quite differently, because obviously we have very different relationship to the sun. But then we were fortunate that the client was really willing to invest in a tremendous amount of landscape on this building and really make some memorable experience for the patients. See here those systems that do the shading. And then on the interior, a whole theme of bringing nature into that experience and abstractions of nature. This is the main elevator core, clad in redwood, and some of the more intimate experiences for patients and families. And in the end, also a small chapel that occupies one of the courtyards and is used by both patients and staff, where that sort of intimate relationship between nature and people is created again. Another healthcare project closer to New York City and New Jersey. This was an interesting one where we were asked by Memorial Sloan Kettering again to build a new cancer center in an existing 1960s office building that was empty and along the Garden State Parkway. And this is a very deep floor plate, not very pleasant inside, quite dark. And we made this very strong gesture of essentially inserting a slice into that building of greenery, and that brought daylight and an entry experience into the building, and created this, I think, quite unique environment around which all the waiting areas are organized and sort of orient you to light at all times. And then around the perimeter, using a high degree of transparency in all of the spaces. You know, there are a lot of healthcare environments you go to where you come down a hallway and you simply don't see outside. And we flipped that paradigm where we brought all the circulation to the perimeter. Those are actually the existing windows of the existing building, and we allowed all the circulation to move along the window and then borrowed light into the treatment spaces so that everybody got a chance to be on the edge of the building. And at the same time sort of gave a very strong new identity at the entry. So that existing building is over here and actually just remained. We replaced the windows themselves, but the precast panels are still there. And this is obviously all new. So moving from healthcare into commercial work. And this project is not built, but it's went away and it may be resurrected. I'm hopeful. This is our sort of first foray into a really tall building. And I know there's a maybe negative connotation with some of these very tall, skinny buildings in New York City. But when we were asked to design one, we tried to approach it in a different way. The site here is on 37th Street, which is the Morgan Library is just over here. This is the Empire State Building just down here, Fifth Avenue here. So in a very dense part of the city and not a lot of greenery, not a lot of open space in that part of Manhattan. And one of the challenges with residential buildings, I think in New York is, how do you, is it just you and your apartment and you just happen to run into someone in the elevator? What's the sense of community that gets created in a residential environment? And how can we improve on that? So our thought here was, how can you think about some of the more memorable qualities of a place like Greenwich Village, where there's a balance of building and nature, and introduce that into a tall building, and that sense of shared spaces could be integrated into a tall building. And one of the benefits of doing a skinny building in New York is that when it's that skinny, you're basically saying that the light goes around the building because its footprint is limited. So that's why its proportions so narrow. But it also means that you don't have a height limit. So you can pull the building apart and not have a penalty in terms of the square footage you use. So by doing that, in this case, we pulled it apart and then inserted greenery and amenity into those spaces. And that was then programmed for all different uses at different heights of the building in order to create those amenities. So a ground level view here with the entry, and then a series of, as I said, programmed amenities. So in this case, elevated chef's table space here that could be, if you wanted to have a large dinner party or in a small apartment, you could reserve this room and use it in the building, or something like this where there's an outdoor theater where people can gather on weekends and watch sports or just enjoy each other's company. So so that as an idea was, again, this notion of thinking about how you create a shared environment for people in a dense residential context, and at the same time bring nature into that experience as much as possible in a space, in an area where there really relatively little nature exists. This project is built, and this is just a rendering to start with. This is on Broadway and 11th Street in Manhattan, and it's just across from Grace Church, which is the point at which Broadway first starts to bend as it goes from south to north. So there's sort of this moment where Grace Church marks that change in geometry. And so we really felt it was important to celebrate that condition with this small office building that was designed to target what are called TAMI tenants. Tech, advertising, media, and information is a real estate term I would never have thought of, but I was told about. But really the idea of sort of a modern loft space. And, you know, as I said, the location here in Greenwich Village, which is actually surprisingly populated by technology companies, more than you would imagine. So while we think of it as a purely residential area, it's actually much richer than that. But the issue then really becomes about scale. You know, it's not so much about function, but what people like about Greenwich Village is that more intimate scale. And how do you build an office building and respect that? So what we did was we took that volume of the building that was forced to set back because of zoning in any case, and use that to create a rhythm of setbacks and modulations that created a building that never had more than 2 stories of continuous vertical surface. And even though there's moments where it offsets only slightly, the idea was that you really break down the scale of this building into a much more intimate character. And then in the end, once you'd broken all that down and created outdoor spaces here, then wove that back together so that it could be unified and feel like one building. This is a model here. We looked at the solar aspects and the way light hit it as well. And then here are some images that show how that came out. And actually, I think I've got, I'll come back to it later, but you can see here, you know, the idea of these, the way that these wall surfaces are treated, even though the next level up is only offset slightly, the idea that you really are understanding it as a series of 2-story elements that stack upon one another. One of the things that's interesting here is the real estate market in New York is very much about outdoor space now. And this happened, we designed this 4 years ago. So it's actually, this is one of the pioneers of that thinking. And the notion that these aren't just balconies that are small, sort of minor elements, but in fact, extensions of the workplace. You're not actually allowed to rent that space, but they actually can charge a premium for the space adjacent to it, so that, you know, that outdoor space really becomes a way that you can enjoy the outdoors. And especially in the pandemic era, then access to outdoor spaces become even more important. This building was actually retooled with a whole series of HVAC systems and touchless entries and things like that to become more appealing in the post-pandemic era. This is a view of the lobby here, and we have a courtyard that exists through that lobby the other side, so that the courtyard in front of Grace Church is linked visually to the courtyard that we created in the rear of this building. And here you can start to see how that space developed. It's still a rendering, but it, you know, very transparent, open glass and connection to the church, and great views from the top of the building. I think I do have, this is a construction photo from about a month ago, just showing how that's evolved and getting close. The glass has a strange color to it because it still has the backing on the glass, and that has to be removed so that it looks more transparent. So it's not as opaque as it looks in these photos. And then a view from the inside, a double height space at the very top of the building that looks out at the crown or the spire of Grace Church, and the view on the right there, how it's actually evolving. Someone's already leased this space, and I can't remember who it is, but it's one of the highest rents in New York City, which it's hard to believe, but we're not really in the business of doing office buildings all the time, but when we do, they're expensive. So now moving on to some things that happened during sort of the COVID times, if you will, and you know, we, like many other firms, were faced with a situation where work dried up or work stopped, and we had a staff that was eager to engage in the challenges that everyone faced. And one of our staff members came up with this idea. I take no credit for this whatsoever, but I did work with her on it. And what she imagined or realized as we got into sort of April of 2020 was that there was a real need for testing to get out into the community. And instead of having to come to a centralized location, how could you actually get the testing into underserved, especially underserved communities? And she came up with this notion of no one's going to school anymore, and there's all these school buses sitting empty. Could you repurpose buses to actually become mobile testing labs? So we dove into that feet first and head first, and started to explore how that could work with really not, we've done a lot of healthcare work, but we weren't, lab scientists or anything, and how could that work? But we started to test ideas about how you could configure a bus, what you would do to organize the spaces within it, what that flow needed to be for the samples, how could they be, could you engage with the customer or the patient, take a sample, have that test right there in the bus, and then basically have an electronic output that told you whether you were positive or negative. And we actually took this quite a ways. We actually met with a whole series of companies that wanted us to work with them to actually build these buses in 2020. And eventually we sort of had to let it drop because we're really not in that business, and we didn't want to become business people to do that. But the idea was out in the public domain, and it was actually adopted by New York City and a lot of private companies that, as you saw in that first slide I showed you, are all over the place still in New York. Now they're giving vaccines, not just testing. But the other aspect of this is that we started to work with a nonprofit organization in New York called New York City Relief to extend that idea. They already had some buses, and they contacted us and wanted us to help them work with their customers who are essentially homeless people in the city. And what they wanted was some form of way to talk to people without a mask on, because a lot of the homeless people were really uncomfortable. They're already uncomfortable confronting people that represent authority, which can be aid organizations. And so is there some way that we could create a sort of what we call the pop-up care unit that was a demountable panel that could serve as that interface between the two people. And what was interesting for us was the opportunity to sort of rethink this thing as a understanding of the hierarchical relationship that's created between authority and people who aren't in authority. And often, you're confronted in a hospital or something with someone who's behind a desk, who is often in a higher position than you. And so there's a supplicant quality to you when you arrive in those spaces. And we tried to rethink this thing as something where people were put on an entirely equal basis. And so this sort of zigzag plan evolved of that, where this element could be sort of flat packed and moved from one place to another, and opened up with a window in the middle and a shared sort of environment where both people were on an equal basis. And it wasn't something we actually built, as you can see in my driveway, a mock-up of this thing out of plywood, because we needed to do it quickly just to test it, and we hoped to sort of find a manufacturer to build it. And we took it a little farther. In these drawings, it was actually included in the Cooper Hewitt's recent show about design for challenges in the pandemic. And very proud of where that went. Another thing we did during that time period was with the Van Allen Institute sponsored something called Neighborhoods Now, which brought architects and contractors and landscape architects, a whole group of professionals into different neighborhoods in the city to help them in their process of emerging from the pandemic. And in this case, we worked with the Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition to build them. What they really wanted was a place for their library, and they had no interior space. So we figured out a way to make an outdoor library for them, using all basically parts that we could buy at Home Depot, which had donated a bunch of money to help do all this. So a group of people in our office formed a collaboration to look at different ways that you could use all of these systems that you sort of buy off the shelf, wooden crates, things like that, at Home Depot, and create this environment that was easily constructed and demountable in the bad weather, and an outdoor environment where you could gather and really have a sense of open access to books, but also to sort of movie nights and things like that. And this got to a certain point and then lost its traction for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. It's too bad, because I really wanted this to happen, but it was really an engaging experience. So one last project I'll show you, and this is one that's not complete yet, but is in Philadelphia, and it's a very different scale, obviously, from what I just showed you. This is an office building that we've been designing for the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And it's really a giant make-ready project. They're going to build a whole new hospital, and they need to get all their doctors out of where they are now and put them in one place so that they can build their hospital. And at the same time, relocate all of their mechanical systems up onto the roof of this building so that they could build another building. So it sounds like it's not sure, it could have just been a kind of not aspirational project, but we saw a lot of opportunity in it. It has this tremendous site that faces out to the Schuylkill River and to the rest of the city and forms part of this sort of continuous wall of buildings. Unfortunately, this is an older aerial here, but Norman Foster just finished a whole new hospital building over here. This is a building by Raphael Vignoli. This is a building by, I'm blanking on the name, but a Philadelphia firm here. KPF did the original hospital building back here. Perkins and Will actually did a building back here, and we have another one here. So there's a whole series of modern and quite aspirational buildings in what's called the medical district in Philadelphia. And we have this site that has tremendous presence on the skyline. And the sort of imagined solution, I think, here when they first started was, oh, well, there's a big glass wall, and that's an office building, and it could just be a simple form. And we tried to think beyond that, and so that we really had to maximize the volume of the building here, but we wanted to relate it to what was around that. The building next to it is actually a clinical building, an outpatient facility that Caesar Pelli did. I should have mentioned him too. And so what we came up with was this idea of a wall that actually adapts to its solar orientation. The client, when we first started the project, said, I want to build a building with an active facade. And what he meant was actually moving parts. And while I would love to do that sort of thing, if you want to design a building with moving parts in a freeze-thaw climate and put your stamp on it, then God love you. But that's just not something that's actually going to really work, and probably wasn't really plausible. So we came up with the next best thing, which was to take a wall that actually, instead of having a series of different wall types that face different directions, we took one wall type and we let it adapt towards its solar orientation, and which was really this sort of, I should go back one slide, this southern corner of the site is really here. And so by taking this wall and actually creating more texture and more depth as it wraps around the building, It's sort of what I call the concertina quality. It goes from flat to crenellated and then back to flat again across the width of the building. You can sort of see in this construction photo, and then in these views you can see it a little bit more, where the more a deep corner here facing south with more shading, and then over here on the north where it's almost completely flat. So it's really one wall that compresses and folds on itself as it moves around the building. So we're looking forward to seeing how that looks when it's finally done, but that's where we are. So thank you. Happy to answer any questions if you have.
Setback. Setback 9. Setback 9.
Yep.
You know, how do you thought about you've worked in a variety of situations. Do you find some things you may learn from some requirement inspires you when it isn't a requirement, but maybe a good design constraint or something to explore? That makes sense. I guess that sort of sounding like I wanted to influence a little here somewhere else. I'm not trying to do that necessarily, but you clearly are so involved with scale and modulation of volumes and skins and things. Just wondering how you think about, and clearly on this one, we're clearly thinking about that in a way this whole thing shouldn't be a moving concertina.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Is there something in that ramble on my part that
yeah, right. Well, you know, perhaps what I should have explained a little bit more about this project is that, you know, it was an attempt, and I'm not sure if it's successful, but to take that, what could have been just a huge flat glass wall and give it a sense of scale that might make it a little bit more humanistic, almost hopefully in a sort of almost honeycomb quality. You know, one of the things about doctors is that they're often there early in the morning, and then they go off and they treat patients, and then they're done. You know, their lives are 5 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. And in the morning, you've got a lot of low angle sun. And so when we develop this wall, you can see in this image that when you see this building, this is actually looking from the east, how opaque it is in this direction. And yet, you know, when you're on this side, it's almost all glass. So the notion was thinking about what their experience would be from the inside of the building, even though I didn't show images of that, and using that to generate the idea of the wall. So, you know, human and nature were sort of intersecting there. And I won't ever say that I don't borrow one idea from one project, and I think we all do. When we have a good idea, maybe it doesn't get to work on this project, but it does on another. But to me, I think, as you could see from this show, none of these projects look the same. And I think that's a real challenge for architects to make each project unique. And, you know, we all know of architects, famous architects, who you just have to look at it and you know who designed it. And I would actually be proud to say if someone looked at the work I've done in my career and not know that I designed it, because that would prove to me that it was unique. And yet I think there's still a sense of an underlying set of parameters that drive this, you know, the living design aspects that I mentioned before, that underlie every one of these projects, and the way that nature and human experience are brought into these, you know, are always there. It's just in very different ways. So does that answer your question? Sure.
That's the level of that's not the word. And I want to talk a little bit about the project forward. Speaking about where do you see
Well, one of the things I tried to say in the beginning was that during the pandemic, whether, how do you know if you're working? Are you at home or it's like the conflation of those experiences is something we've all experienced, and so the way that starts to challenge the paradigms and the patterns that we've all experienced in life previous to this, I think is a great thing. Actually, it's the one good thing that's come out of this experience, is that it's really accelerated things to be very different than they used to be. And I'm very much guilty. I was one of those people who used to say, you got to be in the office all the time. And now I don't say that. I was talking with Ruben about how easy it is to do work remotely now. I think we've all discovered that that can work in a very effective way. And so it's changed the way that we think about work. And I think that's a good thing. And it's going to then result in a whole different kind of architecture or design in the future that responds to the different way we think about our culture. And I think it's going to open up, we're going to look back on this even 5 years from now and say, this is the moment where things pivoted, and hopefully in a good way. It's going to open up all sorts of new possibilities about different building types and different ways to think about space and how we communicate. And I think this is a great moment. And this is sort of self-serving to suggest that we're part of that, but I do feel that some of those things that we were thinking about prior have sort of now been accelerated by this to become even more present in our thinking. And we haven't fully designed that many projects, or at least not ones that I'm able to show you, since the pandemic started that reflect that. But I can definitely tell you it's changed our thinking about how we work. So that makes sense.
I think the way you brought the nature, the natural love, the built environments together really has brilliant, solutions. I think that's terrific, and that is certainly a concern in today's design. Well, what you haven't done is address the controversy and social justice issues of who owns those natural spaces. And in fact, one of the criticisms of those tall, narrow buildings, that you've created these beautiful natural centers, but they're private spaces. And that office building you created, as you mentioned, has some of the highest commercial rents. And again, because those are private spaces, there's no accessibility to the public, and yet you're building up the environment. So how did we go the next step to allow some of those beautiful spaces to be enjoyed, accessible to the entire community?
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with you. You get certain clients and you work within certain parameters, and even to get that client for that tall tower to accept the idea of this shared space, and I said shared, not public, right? It was a bit of a challenge, but eventually they came around to that. One project I didn't show here, we were just asked to look at a building in Washington, D.C. for a developer who's on the board of a medical school project we're doing right now. And he said he had built a whole series of residential buildings, and he had one site left that was an office, what was meant to be an office building program on that site. He said, I really want this to be a focal point of the neighborhood. I want to make it the iconic building, and gave us an opportunity to study that. And we came up with 3 ideas, actually all based on that living design set of parameters with different emphasis. One was based on on performance and making a net zero building. Another one was based on bringing nature literally into the building in a lot of different ways. But the one that I think was most intriguing was how can we create a civic space in a private environment? And one of the things that's really changed certainly in Manhattan, I'm not sure how much elsewhere, is that conventional retail is really not the same anymore. You know, with online retail these days, you know, so many storefronts now in Manhattan are empty or just not. And so that whole ground level experience of a city is changing. And so what we proposed in that third scheme that we still haven't gotten an answer to yet, we hope to, is what if we made that into a space that was somehow both private and public, and that there was some aspect of that they could use it to generate some income, but at the same time, you could walk into the space at any time and use it. And I don't mean sort of like the atrium spaces that you see at the back of towers in New York City. It was actually almost like the heart of the building, the front porch, if you will, of an office building. So we basically took the building and lifted it up and made this multifunctional event and sort of amenity space that was kind of the place where you could imagine that on a Saturday afternoon you would take your kids, and what we did was we built a whole gym as a program below the below grade or partly below grade of the building. So you could go and have physical activity, but also basically go and hang out and see your friends on the ground floor of this building and create what we hoped would be a public space in a private environment, and challenge, just as you said, that notion. The developer hasn't answered us yet. Hopefully he can get his head around that and maybe say yes, but it probably goes beyond what he imagined that would be. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's.
There is no answer, but it's one of the issues that's being wrestled with, you know,
Yeah.
obviously who owns those spaces and public access, because, you know, up until the pandemic, I was working at 55 Broadway. There was no place even to walk and sit and have a cup of coffee.
Yeah. Yeah.
The whole downtown area.
Yeah.
I hope this doesn't sound like a critique of your lecture, but
I'm ready. I'm ready.
I really appreciate the way that each of the projects he's presented kind of had a clear strategy to address the topic. Started out with terms of integrating nature or you didn't focus so much on the human interactions that you were creating, but I think that was clear from what you showed. And then you end with this project, which has a very much more specific kind of way of addressing that performative kind of level. And yet the first project that you showed seemed to have everything, like it had all the different strategies kind of in one building. So I was just kind of curious if that was intentional, that you kind of started with the whole, like all the strategies kind of all in one complex and then kind of parse them apart, or is it just
I think I just tried to group them into the different types of work we do. And the first one was the two, academic projects. Strangely enough, we're not doing that many academic buildings. Actually, that's not true. We just started a whole new building for Barnard College that should actually encompass all the things you just mentioned. But it wasn't deliberate in terms of a path from one type to another. It was probably just because that was, and they were grouped from older to newer. So that's the other aspect of this, is that was the oldest project among the ones that really fit this theme. So
I'm really glad that you were talking about what happens on that ground floor. Like you have retail, that's the classic thing to activate the street, and you have beautiful buildings and design and thoughtfulness about integration of nature and human elsewhere, but what happens on the traditional level of nature, and what it seems like it's like a new frontier almost, like what happens on the pedestrian level, how could you connect every man to the building, and what happens in that like zone, and is that so that I think that's like a question mark there, like got everything kind of thoughtful about what happens in the building and how to integrate it into a kind of campus, but what happens when the vertical surface and the ground surface kind of come together, what activates the street, it's like a question mark in this new day and age.
Yeah, I think I mean, I walk every day from Grand Central to my studio, and the experience in New York is very different than it used to be. It's much less busy and much less active, and so many of those retail storefronts that used to be full of people or full of activity or full of whatever, and that was the default of what the ground level experience was. And I think it's really, there is an opportunity now to rethink what the urban realm is at the ground level, and how do you replace. There's still going to be a certain amount of retail, but it's never going to be the way it was, And our new we just moved to a new studio, and we're in a second floor of an office building at 31st and Broadway, and it was designed back in the 70s. One of those buildings that had 2 stories of retail, that you could imagine a store where you came in and you go upstairs and they had a whole second floor because there was that much demand for retail. That doesn't happen anymore. So now they give the space away cheap to architects, right? And well, not that cheap, but that's already, exists. So many of the storefronts in Manhattan are these horrible, like fake bank storefronts that really are glorified ATMs and don't really have people in them and don't really activate. They're just advertising sort of within the building. One of my good friends is an architect who became a real estate developer. And I've had some very strong arguments with him about why I think that actually the city should adopt a new form of zoning for the ground plane, where you can't actually have a continuous bank storefront for 100 feet along a whole block, which does exist, and that actually every commercial or any development that has retail should first have a limited amount of frontage, and then also force the developer to have a certain number of small storefronts that can accommodate the kind of mom and pop retail that used to exist in New York, because those service industries don't happen anymore. They're priced out. You still see them in Brooklyn, but in Manhattan, you just don't see them anymore. So that urban realm is now, relegated to really expensive restaurants or very expensive stores or banks, and everyone banks online now, so I don't even know why you need them. So it's sort of amazing.
Yeah, and a lot of that was occurring pre-pandemic.
Yes.
And a lot of it was driven by the fact that in your financing covenants, you require a per square foot minimum rent.
Yeah.
And so the retail establishment of today can't afford those rents over the long term. So a lot of those spaces sit empty and then are sometimes periodically occupied by pop-ups, but there's no long-term leases because the economics covenants that finance the building are not realistic in terms of what the retail tenant can pay today. So and obviously now with the vacancy rates down in New York, it's going to compound that problem. As you said, all the mom and pops were being driven out already, and every building renovation or new building had covenants for financing beyond the retail.
Well, one of the other things that's come up recently in New York, which is interesting, is this notion of converting these vacant office buildings into residential buildings and repopulating downtown. And that's not a new idea. It's actually, that's another idea that was there before the pandemic and has now been accelerated. And I actually have some fairly in-depth conversations with a friend who's works for a major construction manager, another one who does real estate financing, and another one who is a real estate developer, and tried to get to the heart of why that doesn't happen or why it doesn't happen more. And it actually comes back to the issue of the banks, because what happens is that the landlord has negotiated, because most of those buildings have a lease, and they've negotiated a lease that's based on a commercial return. And the minute you try to change an office building into a residential building, the return is much less. And the banks won't refinance for that, at least not now, not yet. They may see that they have to after a while because they won't be getting any money. But once that pivots, I mean, there's also a zoning aspect of this, that the zoning has to be really changed enough to allow for this to happen. But once that happens, there definitely could become a trend of these sort of second tier office buildings in Manhattan being renovated to make residential space, which would be ideal, because then you'd bring people back into downtown and they would have to have a place to eat and shop and everything. And ideally, you could then put those mom and pop stores into one of those developments, and it would be a great, it's very logical to us architects why that should happen. And yet there's a lot of reasons behind the scenes why they don't. And it's funny when you end up talking to the people with the money, that's why. It's the banks that really need to loosen their grip on these things.
You're right, that trend from office to residential really started with 9/11 and then was accelerated by Hurricane Sandy.
Yep.
And a lot of developers did move in, but again, the rents, even the rents they were charging, my apartment went from $5,000 a month to $21,000 a month. Those are the kinds of rents they could get,
Yeah. Well, the other thing that happened right before, leading up to the pandemic, was that there was a huge influx of foreign money into New York, all the from Asia and from Russia and everything, and they were just buying up every property they could find, and the price of land was going through the roof. And that's what generates those really tall towers that we did one of, I admit, but we didn't build it. But the ones that did get built along 57th Street are all driven by this incredible demand for return on the land. And that's obviously totally changed now too, right? So that might actually be an opportunity for things to change, so hopefully. Anyway, thank you all for